Grant Bishop had been waiting for this launch for over 4 months. As lead strategist at Prestige Sphere, he had mapped out every scenario, every trend pulse, every micro-influencer ripple the campaign might stir. He had even forecasted the moment when the first bottle of As Ever Rosé would appear on an Instagram story held between manicured fingers, backlit by Tuscany or the Amalfi Coast. The numbers were there. The pre-launch buzz was strong. Meghan Markle's name carried enough intrigue and cultural volatility to guarantee movement. All signs pointed toward a flawless debut. He spent the evening before launch in his downtown office, surrounded by 3 open screens. One tracked early engagement metrics from teaser content, another looped real-time influencer stories, and the third sat on standby for the live order dashboard. Grant had double-checked the price tier himself, $59 for the base bottle, $110 for the paired box, and though he had privately flinched at the markup, he reminded himself that prestige was the product. Not just the wine. By 9 a.m. on launch day, the dashboard lit up with the first wave of orders. Celebrities, stylists, editors all confirming shipments. Grant exhaled and poured himself a coffee. The projection curve began to rise. For the next 5 hours everything went according to plan, but then something odd happened. The curve plateaued, not dipped, not crashed, just stopped, right at the edge of what Grant had called momentum safe zone. His team didn't notice right away. They were too busy posting congratulatory GIFs in the Slack channel. But Grant kept watching the data trickle instead of flow. The conversion rate began slipping, first decimals, then percentages. He refreshed, recalibrated, even checked for a bug in the tracking system. That's when the comments started, coming in. First on Niche Wine Forums Anonymous, but articulate posts questioning the balance, calling the taste elegant but shallow. Then came the meme pages, where someone had layered McGinn's smiling face over a pink-tinted wine glass with the caption, "Pretty on the outside, but so is a picture frame." The joke spread fast. Too fast. Grant's stomach sank. He closed his laptop slowly, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the blank ceiling tiles above him. Something had gone wrong. Subtly, but unmistakably. The hype had been real, but the product had not delivered the emotional punch it had promised, and in that instant, Grant realized the story wasn't going to be about the wine's success. It would be about its silence. The sound of a launch that had hit the air, hovered for a moment, and then evaporated before anyone could catch it. Miles Eckhart had never missed before. Not with fragrance drops, not with limited edition handbags, not even with a silent launch he once orchestrated for a tech founder's luxury skincare line. He was the man who knew how to position a product so well that it barely needed explanation. But this time, something had unraveled beneath him, and it had happened so quietly, so politely, that he almost didn't notice until it was too late. He arrived at the Pacific Palisades estate 30 minutes early for the garden dinner. The space had been curated down to the vine ivory candles flickering on polished stone tables, hand-dyed linens in shades of soft blush, and floral centerpieces designed to match the exact hue of the As Ever Rosé. Everything looked effortless. But Miles knew it had taken 74 hours of labor to make it feel that way. The guest list was perfect. Every attendee had influence in either media, fashion, or culinary circles. He had arranged it as an intimate experience, the kind people whispered about after, not during. As the guests arrived and champagne was served to start, Miles moved through the gathering with ease. He checked that no one was filming without permission, made eye contact with the sommelier, and signaled when it was time to pour the rosé. The bottles were carried in on silver trays. Every detail from the tilt of the wrist to the napkins used had been rehearsed. For the first few minutes, it worked. There were soft murmurs of appreciation, a few polite smiles, clinks of crystal, glasses under fairy lights, but then a shift occurred. One of the stylists gently placed her glass back on the table after a single sip and reached for her water. Another guest leaned toward the waiter and requested a chilled version of something else. And then, in a moment that felt almost surreal, the actor at the far end of the table, one who had been expected to post later that night, laughed and made a passing comment about the wine tasting like aspiration with a splash of watered down fame. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, but it echoed just long enough to bruise. Miles stood frozen behind the hedgerow, just far enough to be unseen but close enough to hear every syllable. He didn't interrupt. He didn't panic. He simply stood still, hands in pockets, feeling the temperature of the evening drop without warning. Later that night, when most of the guests had gone and the crew began clearing plates, Miles stayed behind and walked the length of the table. Half the glasses were unfinished. Some still held untouched wine, the pale pink fading slightly in the candlelight. It wasn't the kind of disaster that made headlines, but it was the kind that echoed inside the rooms that shaped perception. By morning, one of the assistants from the event had clipped the actor's comment and sent it to a friend. Within hours, it was posted on a private forum. A few TikTok accounts picked it up. The soundbite became viral within the day. The joke wasn't sharp, but it was sticky. And the message it carried was fatal. The wine looked better on Instagram than it tasted in person. Miles sat in his apartment that evening, watching the numbers slow and the sentiment shift. The elegance they had so carefully built was starting to wobble, not from an attack, not from scandal, but from something worse: indifference wearing the mask of humor. And he knew then, with absolute certainty, that something had to be done. Before the next laugh turned into the final word, Grant Bishop spent the next 48 hours living inside the data. He barely left his apartment, choosing instead to sit at his dining table surrounded by open screens, printed spreadsheets, and a dry erase board smeared with increasingly frantic arrows. He wasn't trying to salvage the narrative anymore. He was trying to understand where it had collapsed. This wasn't just a failed launch. It was a structural failure of expectation, and Grant couldn't shake the feeling that it had been avoidable. He ran sentiment analysis tools until they blurred into background noise. The comments hadn't turned venomous. That would have been easier. What he saw instead was detachment. People weren't angry, they were amused. They called it pretty wine for people who don't like wine. Others joked that it came with Adi Hobby, discount code for disappointment. The irony of the branding As Ever, which had implied permanence and class, was now being memed as the slogan for empty luxury. Still, Grant kept searching for the precise moment things shifted. Then he remembered a call he had taken 3 weeks earlier with Dominic Frey, a vintner in Napa who had provided early production consultation. Dominic had warned him, in plain terms, that the wine didn't carry enough weight. It had aesthetic potential, yes, and the visual branding was almost perfect, but the blend lacked confidence. Grant hadn't taken it seriously at the time. He had been too dazzled by the narrative arc. Now, he booked a last-minute flight and drove straight from the airport to Dominic's office. A plain wooden structure nestled between vines that had lived longer than most brands. Dominic didn't bother offering pleasantries. He poured 2 glasses, his own house white, and leaned against the counter while Grant recounted everything. The soft launch, the viral backlash, the silence from key influencers. Dominic listened without interrupting, and when Grant finally paused, he nodded and spoke plainly. He explained that when a product is sold on story instead of substance, it risks becoming a ghost the moment the story is questioned. He said people had bought into a lifestyle, not a taste. And when that lifestyle revealed itself to be hollow, the product had nothing left to stand on. Grant finished his glass in silence. He didn't try to argue, On the flight back to Los Angeles, he revised his report for the third time. He included a new header in bold: narrative outpaced product integrity. Beneath it, he listed the critical failures: price point overreach, over-reliance on image, and no contingency for public detachment. The final section simply read, "Public saw through the glass." He arrived back to find the metrics had dipped. Again, retail partners were delaying rollouts. Editors were quietly swapping coverage. The shelf life of As Ever had entered freefall. And in that moment, as Grant stared down at his muted phone buzzing with unread emails, he finally stopped thinking about the numbers. He began thinking about the people, the customers who had bought a bottle expecting magic and had found something perfectly forgettable. He had spent his career convincing people that perfection could be manufactured. Now, he wasn't so sure. Miles Eckhart sat alone in the back room of a once popular concept cafe on Melrose, one of the few public spaces left where no one cared who he was. The buzz of espresso machines played faintly in the distance, but inside his private booth, there was only the soft scratch of his pen against a notepad. The digital world outside was still spinning in circles about the wine. Meme pages had crowned As Ever the Duchess of Diluted Dreams. Influencers had quietly removed the bottles from their backdrops. Even the food blogs had stopped mentioning it, and yet, for the first time in days, Miles wasn't panicking. He was planning. He had spent the last 3 nights revisiting the moments that went wrong. The laughter at the garden dinner. The flat taste profile that no amount of candlelight could disguise. The viral clip that had turned the brand's elegance into a late-night comedy sketch. He had relived them all, not to wallow but to locate the fault line. He finally understood what had gone wrong. They had built everything around an image, around an aura. But people didn't want another bottled fantasy. They wanted something real. Something they could trust even without knowing who designed the label. Something that didn't feel like it belonged in a curated feed, but on a dinner table between real conversations. So he picked up his phone and began dialing. He called Émile Renaud, a reclusive vintner in Provence whose wines were notoriously complex and almost impossible to license. He called a flavor